In this video, I want to talk about how you can use Docker and Nginx to deploy your web app with SSL certificate. On YouTube, I watched a tutorial video by Traverse Media and I found it really useful. Here are some notes from him. I learned a lot from the tutorial. What this is doing is installing Nginx onto a virtual machine and then configure Nginx server with SSL certificate. So I was wondering if I can do the same thing with Docker containers. Here's my example code. I want to briefly explain it. So I have a server and a front end. The server is written with Node.js and the front end is written in React. I have opened the two main files for server and front end. So the regular way to develop is npm start within front end and Nginx app.js for server. So this is a very simple React app with only two pages, the home page and the post page. The post page contains some dummy post data. The data is from my server. If we look at the front end, I have two routes. One is the root, which is the home page. One is posts, which is the post page. For the home page, it's only displaying a title and a link to the post page. And for the post page, it's sending a request to my server, asking for some data, and then it will render the data as the title, ID, and body. If the server request failed, it will display error. So if I stop the server now and refresh, I will get the error here. On the server side, server is listening on port 8080 by default unless we set an environment variable for port. And I have two GET request API. This one is just for verifying that the server is running. And this one is for the dummy post data. The data is also coming from another website, JSON placeholder. When I get a request from my front end, I will send the request to this API and then send the response back to my front end. This is basically the example web app, and I want to deploy this onto a server and install SSL certificate. Before that, I want to briefly talk about another method I used in another video, which is to host the front end along with the server. First of all, I want to npm run build within front end to make a production build for the React app. This will create a build directory containing some static files, and the front end will be served through the index.html. What this line does is making the build directory a static directory. When a request is sent to the server, it will look into this directory to look for a file that can be served. And by default, it's index.html. So if we start the server, it's running on port 8080. So instead of 3000, we will change this to 8080. We should also get this React app. And both pages are served from the index.html. So there's a problem here. If we enter /posts instead of using the links here, we will not be able to get the post because post is neither a file in the build directory nor an API method. So the solution is to use this piece of code. So this is a wildcard. If we reach this line, that means we cannot find a method to resolve this request. So instead, we will again send this index.html back. So let's save. And now if we request this page again, we should be able to get the post page, no matter if we are using the link or the URL. And we will be using the same concepts in the Nginx server. So now I want to serve this website with Nginx and Docker. Now I will comment out the two lines because we will not need them for the Nginx server, and we will be using Docker to serve this website. Here is a Docker Compose file. There are two services in this file, the server and the front end. The server is running on Node.js 12. This volume is binding this directory to this directory on the container. The env file contains some environment variables for the server. What I have is a port number, port 80 instead of 8080. Entry point is a shell script for seeding to the code and install dependencies, and lastly, start the server. If a dev environment variable is specified, it will run npm run dev. And the difference is npm start the server with node, and run dev use node demo. For front end, we will be using a Docker file. The Docker file is here. The base image is Ubuntu 18, and that's because we will be installing certbot. It only supports Ubuntu and not the latest Ubuntu 20. This long command here is basically installing many dependencies, including Nginx. The curl and vim are for debugging purpose. They're not necessary. These dependencies are for configuring SSL certificate, and we also need to expose port 80. Here we have a port mapping from port 80 in the container to port 80 of the host. This volume is binding the production build to this directory in the Nginx container. This volume is binding a configuration file of Nginx to this location. It's a default Nginx configuration. And let's have a look at the defaults.conf. The content was copied from a real Nginx server, and the only thing I've changed are these lines. So server name, you want to set it to be the domain name you want to use for your SSL certificates. The first location is for serving the static files of the front end. So it's using this directory as the root. So whenever a request is sent to the Nginx server, it will look at this file. This location is for configuring a reverse proxy. Whenever the Nginx server sees a request prefixed with API, it will send the request to this URL. So server is the service name in the Docker Compose file. So whatever you use here, you need to use it here. It will redirect the request to the server, which is here. Now let's try to run this. Docker Compose up. So if we open another tab and enter localhost, it should be port 80. And we can see that it's serving the website, and we can get the posts. So the next step is to deploy this on a real server and configure the SSL certificate. I will be using Digitalocean. Let's create a new droplet. Ubuntu 20 is fine. I'll be using the cheapest one. I already added my SSH key. The key should be here, cd into home.ssh. My key is here. The public key is what I added to Digitalocean. If you don't have the file, you can use SSH keygen to generate the key, but I will not generate a new one. With SSH keys, you will not need to enter a password for authentication. Let's create it. The server is ready. I will copy the IP address and let's try to SSH into it. Maybe it's not ready yet. Let's wait some time and try again later. Okay, now it's ready. Great. Since we'll be using Docker, we need to install Docker first. So if you search on Google about how to install Docker on Digitalocean, there are some tutorials, and you will just need to enter them line by line. Okay, so the Docker is already running. Then we need to move ourselves into the Docker group. So now if we cat etc group, we should see ourselves root in the Docker group. Let's quit and SSH again. Now if we run Docker PS, we should get no container. And if we run idng, we should see which group we are in. Next, we will also need to install Docker Compose, since we will be running multiple services with Docker Compose file. So we will do the same thing, just copy everything line by line. Now let's transfer this app to the server. I already pushed the code to GitHub, so I will clone it. I also made some notes here. Now if we cd into Docker and Nginx, we can see all the source code. However, the production build directory, the production build folder was ignored by Git. So let me transfer this file to my server. scpr frontend build. Okay, the build folder is transferred. Let's have a look. Move the build to the front end. Now if we check the front end again, it should be here. Before deploying this app, let's change some configuration for Nginx. So here we want to change the server name. Instead of domain.com, I will be using my domain name. I will call it web.rockversion.com, and the same thing here. Now we can try to Docker Compose up. So now it's installing the dependencies for the front-end image. Now it's deployed. Let's go to this public IP. Great. So the website is now running on port 80 of my server. Yeah, post is running properly. And if we enter post, we can go to post. So now the problem is SSL is not configured. So if we enter HTTPS, it's not gonna work. So let's stop it. I will run it in the background. And I want to go into this container. Docker executes it container name. And since the base image is Ubuntu, I can use bash. So now we're in the front-end container. The command to use for configuring SSL certificate is, you can find it here. Enter a domain name. But this will not work yet because I need to point my domain name to this IP address. So let me copy this IP. I use AWS for my domain name. So I will need to go to Route 53. Host zones. My domain name. And I should already have this record. I just need to change the IP address. So notice that this domain name is pointing to our public IP, and the www variant is pointing to this domain name. So basically, they're pointing to the same IP. Great. Now we can run this command. There's one thing that you need to keep in mind. Sometimes changing the IP address of a domain name doesn't take effect immediately. So if the domain name is not pointing to your IP, this command will not work. If you want to verify, you can go to DNS lookup. Enter your domain name and verify that the IP is the same as the IP of your server. Okay, so now they're saying we can keep going. Agree. Share your email address, I will say no. So now they're challenging the domain name. If your domain name is not pointing to the public IP, this will fail. And now it's asking whether you want to redirect HTTP traffic to HTTPS. And I will say yes. So basically, whenever I send the request with HTTP protocol, it will be redirected to HTTPS. Now it works, but this is with the public IP. If we replace this with a domain name, this will work perfectly. It's not secure and using HTTPS protocol. If you enter HTTP, it will also be redirected to HTTPS. There is another thing you need to keep in mind. Since we're using volume, in the Docker Compose file, this default configuration file is binded to this location in the Nginx, and installing SSL certificates will make some modification to that file. Now, if you look at this file, you can see that these are the content we had earlier, but these are some new lines added by certbot, managed by certbot. And also, these lines are for HTTP redirection. And these new lines are also added by certbot. If you fail to deploy and you want to do this again, you cannot just Docker Compose. You cannot just Docker Compose up and go into the container and run certbot. If you look at git status, the file is modified. You instead need to type Git Restore to restore the configuration before you can deploy again.